I don't like baseball. I know, un-American, right? But come on, it's unwatchable. I cannot watch it in my house. I cannot watch it in a bar. I can't watch it with friends or listen alone in my car. I cannot watch them scratch and stand. I don't like baseball, Sam I am. I didn't grow up watching it. I could never get into it. But all my friends are sports junkies. And that means that for 180 days out of the year, I'm left out of conversations while they watch and talk about baseball. And worse than being left out of the conversation is when I don't get invited on summer events. Like, because, well, you don't like baseball, so we didn't think to invite you. Thankfully for me, my friends are problem solvers. And one year, my friend Tyler invited me to play in his fantasy baseball league. Like my best friend once did for me, I'd like to try to talk you into playing fantasy sports. And why should you listen to me about this? Well, I've been playing for years now. I've researched the topic extensively. And, like you, I used to not play. Now, according to the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, 14% of all Americans now play fantasy sports. So if you know 10 people, one or more of them are likely to play. And fantasy sports is an extension of the sports fan experience. According to Nielsen's ratings, as reported by an article on talentleague.com, 81% of Americans watch sports. And numbers don't lie. This affects you or someone you love. You should try playing fantasy sports because, well, they're fun, and because they help keep you and your family and friends connected, and because playing fantasy sports increases your knowledge about the sports that you play in and makes them more enjoyable to watch or talk about. Fantasy sports are fun? Oh, Mike, that's just your opinion. Well, is it? What if I could quantify that for you? First, let's figure out how we define fun, and then we'll see if fantasy sports measures up. Big part of having fun is that you're doing something that is entertaining. In his New York Times best-selling book, Fantasy Life, ESPN's fantasy analyst Matthew Berry tells us that 6.6% of people in 2012 watched the American Idol finale. Now, they did this because it was entertaining, right? Well, in that same year, 13% of all Americans played fantasy sports, so twice as many people found that to be entertaining. Now, I said earlier that the FSTA says that 14% now play, so it's a growing industry. Now, fun is also a biochemical reaction. According to the Psychology of Winning, an article on cbsnews.com, when we are having fun, dopamine is released in the brain, and that makes us feel better. In that same article, it tells us that competing in, and especially winning a game, releases dopamine in the brain, so we're having fun. A game is a physical or mental contest that has rules and that people do for pleasure. A competition, or a contest, includes competition and winning. In an article called The Benefits of Feeling Competitive in Psychology Today, all people feel competitive to some degree or another. In that same article, it says that if we suppress these feelings, it leads to negative impacts on ourselves, such as an increased level of cynicism, increased tendency to gossip, or even self-hatred. Alright, so let's check fantasy sports. Is it a game? Yep. Is it a contest that involves competition and winning? Yep. So it's fun, and it keeps us from self-hatred. Also a good thing. So we decided that fantasy is fun, but fun isn't all that fantasy sports brings to the table, or your tablet, or your mobile device. Fantasy sports can also help keep friends and family connected. Everyone loses touch with people. The high school classmates, college classmates, they graduate, they move away, families grow, people get busy. We all need a way to stay connected. For me, working full-time and going to school takes up a lot of my time. If it wasn't for fantasy sports, I might have completely lost touch with several of my friends. And I'm not alone. In Fantasy Life, Matthew Berry shares with us several stories from leagues that have helped keep friends together over time and distance. One of those leagues is made up of 10 UNLV students that years after graduation, none of them live in Nevada anymore. But every year, they all plan a week's vacation in which they go to Las Vegas, highlighted by their fantasy draft, which they hold at different places along the strip. That sounds like fun. Another story about fantasy sports making someone feel connected is Matthew's very first fantasy league that he was involved in. At 14 years old, he had moved around a lot, but he had landed in College Station, Texas, where he was sort of an outcast, an ostracized Jewish boy in a Christian community, and he didn't have a lot of friends until he was invited to join a fantasy league. 30 years later, hundreds of miles, and a successful media career, he still flies back to College Station every year for the draft and to play in this league. Fantasy sports not only help us feel connected, but it can also build and strengthen those bonds. In a November 2014 article on ESPN.com called Love Hate, written by Matthew Berry, he relates to us a story of BJ Sullivan. Now, BJ is a 31-year-old cancer patient staying in a hospital with a strict family-only visitation policy. But fantasy was very important to BJ. And so his league mates had the fantasy draft for that league that year in the hospital lobby, where the workers were able to bring him down and they could hang out. Now, through constant interaction and the workers seeing how fantasy sports uplifted BJ's spirits, they gradually allowed league members to visit him, and the league was actually there for BJ's final moments when he lost his battle with cancer. So fantasy sports are fun, and they help us keep connected to friends and family and build those bonds. But Mike, you remember how you didn't like baseball? Well, I'm not into sports that much either. Oddly, fantasy sports can help us with that too. See, people are generally social creatures, but they also feel more comfortable interacting and socializing about topics and events that they know more about. So when people follow fantasy sports, they learn more about the sports that they follow. Now, how likely is it that sports are a topic that's going to come up in a conversation near you? Well, this is America, and according to usnews.com, 319 million people live here. According to the Nielsen ratings published on talentleague.com, in 2013, 255 million people watch sports. That means 4 out of 5 people you know, they watch sports. This is going to come up in conversation. Fantasy sports helps you get to know sports better because as you follow the players on your team, you get more acquainted with those players and better recognition of them when you see them on TV or at a live event. Following statistical scoring categories also drives curiosity to learn more about the rules of sports that drive those stats. In that industry demographics article on FSTA.com, it also tells us that fantasy sports is multi-demographical, and by playing them, you can get involved in a very large social network. And not a social network of just geeks in basements anymore. The average fantasy player is middle to upper middle class. 18% of all college-educated people play fantasy sports, and the fastest growing demographic in fantasy sports, all the way up to 8% now, is women. So fantasy sports can help your social life. But that's only one reason you should play. The biggest reason that anyone, and especially you, should play fantasy sports is because they're fun. But they also help us keep connected with friends and family. And they increase our knowledge of a topic of conversation that's pretty common. That said, hey, I still don't like baseball. But now when I walk into a bar to meet my friends and a baseball game's on, I think, ugh, baseball. Hey, wait, is that the Marlins? And that's the rookie pitching? And he's gone 7 scoreless? Yes! Because who's got that guy in fantasy? Me. And I also know about the pennant race. Well, I know what it is now. And I can talk about it because, hey, I've got players on 2 division-leading teams. And because I can have these conversations, I'm now getting invited on those legendary Brewer bus trips. Go Crew. And on those trips, I'm keeping up with my friends, these long-lost friends that don't ever see me because I'm busy giving speeches and stuff. But you know who else goes on that trip? The head of the PR department at my company. I'm a PR major. That seems like a valuable connection to have. Yeah, but that's me, and that's my fantasy story. If you want to know about other people's fantasy stories, because maybe stranger testimony is more helpful and more convincing, check out The Fantasy Life. Look, this guy used to write for Married with Children. He's written in Hollywood. He's a good writer. You'll enjoy the book whether you play fantasy or not. But let's not talk about other people's stories. Let's talk about yours. When you start playing, you're going to have all these experiences that you want to share. So once you're in a league, why don't you tell me your fantasy story?